To be a world champion in the world of wrestling means that you have to be the absolute best. And unfortunately, this also means that some great performers never get to hold the top prize, despite being amongst the most standout people of their era. But who are the biggest examples of this in action? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at today. So join us today as we take a deep dive into the greatest wrestlers to never win a world title. And if we're starting anywhere, we really should do so with one of the most egregious examples, because even if he was never as big of a star as his brother Bret, Owen Hart could have held the top prize with pride and honor had he been given a run with it. In fact, in some people's eyes, he would have done an even better job as champion, as for them, he was actually the better wrestler of the two. Yes, being an early innovator of the high-flying style, the King of Hearts was able to wow audiences every time he stepped in the ring, all the way from his debut in 1983 to his death in 1999. Of course, for most of this period though, there was little opportunity for him to reach the top of the mountain as, being a smaller guy in the land of giants that was the WWF, he was relegated to mostly being a tag team act alongside the likes of Koko B. Ware, Yokozuna, and his brother-in-law the British Bulldog. That said, at one point, there was the perfect opportunity to give him a run as champion, as in 1994, during one of the best feuds Vince McMahon ever booked, Owen went up against his brother Bret. And after beating the Hitman at WrestleMania 10 then, it meant that once the older sibling became the WWF champion later that night, the runt of the Hart litter was the obvious #1 contender. Alas, however, when the two met again at that August SummerSlam inside of a steel cage, it was Bret who retained and, in the process of doing so, took away Owen's closest shot at being able to hold the gold around his waist. Well, kind of, because despite losing here, the younger Hart continued to feud with his brother around the house show circuit for a while, and at one point during this run, he'd actually get a phantom win with the top prize. That was until his cheating ways were uncovered and the finish was reversed. Still, it lasted long enough for some photos to be taken. After that though, Owen's main event run would peter out, as with him still being considered too small for the boss to push at that level in the long run, he'd return to being one of the roster's best kept secrets. That's right, he might never have gotten the full due he deserved, but even if the boss didn't always recognize his skills, fans certainly did. And that's why the likes of Chris Jericho, Adam Cole, and Kevin Owens would all later go on to name him as a major influence in them getting involved in the wrestling industry at all. So maybe in the end, that's just as important to his legacy as winning a world title ever could have been. Of course, Owen wasn't the only person on our list to have a phantom WWF title win be their only brief flirtation with the belt though, because years prior to this, in 1988, the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase did something similar. In his case though, he wouldn't earn a screwy victory during a match he was directly involved in. No, like any truly slimy heel, he'd do so without ever having to lace up his boots. It happened on the February 5th episode of the main event that year when, after paying a referee to get plastic surgery so he could moonlight as Dave Hebner and screw Hulk Hogan out of the belt, DiBiase walked into the ring and simply bought it from the new champion, Andre the Giant. And while this certainly was a suspect way of winning the title, it was something which had been a long time coming for him, because in the years prior, Ted had been one of the top rising stars of the territories, with him making a name for himself in the likes of Mid-South Wrestling. Then, once he joined WWF in 1987, he'd basically be given the role of playing Vince McMahon himself, an uber-rich villain who used his wealth to lord it over all of his minions. Sadly though, despite doing this to perfection, this lone world title run would never be officially recognized, because as a result of the shady circumstances behind his win, DiBiase was stripped of the belt less than a week later, as it was instead held up as vacant pending the results of a one-night tournament at WrestleMania 4. And while DiBiase made it all the way to the finals of this tournament, with the original plans even being for him to win it overall, he'd fall to Randy Savage come the end, as the Macho Man started his own first reign on top. After that then, the $1 Million Man's gradual descent down the card would begin, and he'd never come close to winning a world title again. Of course, he shouldn't feel too bad about this though, because it was the era of Hulkamania, and so despite the roster being absolutely stacked, only a select few ever got to call themselves champion. And if you want an idea of just how stacked it was at this time, you only have to look at the fact that even though he was by far and away one of the greatest heels of all time, Roddy Piper was never even able to win the elusive world title either. Of course, part of the blame for this could be placed at his feet because in the 80s, Piper was notorious for not doing jobs. Why was that? Well, with him believing that once he was seen to have been pinned by someone like Hulk Hogan, his value would drop, the Canadian only ever agreed to lose if it was by means of disqualification or countout. Hell, even at WrestleMania 1 and its precursor, the War to Settle the Score, he never got beaten outright by the Hulkster. And because of this, Vince McMahon no doubt didn't feel confident enough in giving him the belt, just in case he decided he didn't want to drop it. But even if Piper never got to stand atop the mountain during the first boom period, it wasn't like it held him back at all. No, with him having peerless skills on the mic and the ability to draw the kinds of nuclear heat which would put even MJF to shame, Roddy was always able to keep a prominent spot on or near the top of the card. Still though, it's a shame he couldn't have at least gotten one run with the WWF title in the 80s in order to solidify his legacy even more. Because while folks always talk about the importance of Hulk Hogan, Vince McMahon, and Mr. T in making WrestleMania a success, Piper played just as much of a pivotal role too. But he wasn't the only man involved in the first ever WrestleMania main event who never got his full due by having a world title run, because when it came to his partner that night, Paul Orndorf often goes even more forgotten. And that's a crime because even when he was at his peak, there were few better performers in the world than Mr. Wonderful. Hell, it wasn't even just his in-ring skills which earned him a spot on this list. No, it was his ability to draw huge money, as can be evidenced with his run with the Hulkster across the house show circuit during the early 80s. Yes, while the champ may have had more famous opponents in the form of Piper, Randy Savage, or even the Ultimate Warrior, in terms of sheer tickets sold, no one drew more with Hogan than Orndorf did. But then given the fact that prior to his time in New York, he'd already spent years honing his ability to engage audiences over in the territory system, perhaps none of this should come as any surprise. Unfortunately though, by the time the rock and wrestling era was taking off, Orndorf's career was starting to wane, as an arm injury which he never let heal properly ended up leaving him with muscular atrophy. Had he been able to stay at the top of the card a little while longer though, who knows if he would have been able to get that elusive world title run. Either way, we can say for sure that he'd have been a better opponent for the Hulkster the following year than King Kong Bundy was. And if he was still at the peak of his physical skills then, there's no reason he couldn't have beaten the babyface star for the belt. Sure, it would have no doubt been a short run until he dropped it back, but it would have allowed him to conquer the last objective he was sadly never able to. That said, he can take solace in the fact that he's not the worst example of a superstar performer never winning a world title. No, you could make a solid argument that this honor goes to none other than Magnum TA. Now, for younger viewers who may not be as familiar with Magnum TA, he was basically the guy who Jim Crockett Promotions had pegged as their next top babyface star in the mid-80s. And one look at him should make it obvious as to why this was the case, because with his Tom Selleck-esque looks and his impressive in-ring skills, he was a natural for the role. So starting in 1984 then, the Carolina-based territory began building up Magnum to be the top rival of then NWA World's Champion Ric Flair, with the idea being that eventually, after a big money-drawing chase, he'd dethrone the Nature Boy and take his rightful place atop the National Wrestling Alliance hierarchy. Of course, this saw the up-and-comer first have to go up against Flair's Four Horsemen cohort Tully Blanchard, with the two of them having arguably the greatest cage match of all time at Starrcade 1985. Then, once that was done, Magnum defeated Wahoo McDaniel to win the United States Heavyweight title, a move which was generally seen as the final step up the ladder before he eventually went after Flair himself. Sadly though, before this could happen, real life intervened in the cruelest of ways, when in October of 1986, the US champ was involved in a car crash which left him with a broken neck and ended his in-ring career immediately. So instead of reaching his full potential and standing alongside the likes of Harley Race, Dusty Rhodes, and Terry Funk then, Magnum would have to hang up his boots and become a color commentator, a role he continued for the next few years as he slowly came to terms with the fact that he'd never wrestle again. Yes, it was a tragic end to the story, but at least the once heir to the NWA throne survived the incident and even got to make a brief appearance years later on WWE TV at June 2007's Vengeance Night of Champions. And as fate would have it, it was around this time that another legendary figure of the industry was coming close to winning a world title for the first time too. Though in the case of William Regal, it wouldn't be injury which prevented this from happening in the end, it would be a suspension from WWE instead. That's right, despite being in the midst of a career-high run during his role as Raw General Manager, Regal would be suspended from WWE for a failed drug test. So even if he was playing the part of a dictatorial authority figure to perfection, so much so that the company at one point started making early plans to give him the world title, in the end, he was unable to take the most of this opportunity, and the whole idea was scrapped. But had things worked out better, the Englishman would have already been a multiple-time world champion at this point in his career anyway, because with him spending 3 decades prior to that being one of the best wrestlers alive, there was no excuse for him not winning the top prize at least once in one of the major companies he worked for. And sure, you could argue that during his runs with World Championship Wrestling, he was always portrayed as more of a mid-card act and so not championship material, but that has nothing to do with how good he was, and it certainly wasn't anything to do with how much hardcore fans appreciated him. And the same could be said for his initial run in WWF at the turn of the century too, as had he been portrayed as the tough guy fighter he was and not the comedy real man's man, he could have easily been a challenger to the likes of Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. But in the end, things never worked out that way, and so, following his retirement from the ring in 2013, a world title would still be the one thing he was unable to cross off of his bucket list. Not that it made him any less respected though, because with everyone both in the industry and watching at home recognizing his skills, he's since gone on to become one of the most respected elder statesmen out there, and one who currently has his footprints in both WWE and AEW. And he's not the only elder statesman that never won a world title who's currently imparting his wisdom onto the younger generation either, as over in All Elite Wrestling currently, Dustin Rhodes is also imparting his wisdom onto the next generation. So it should come as no surprise then that he's become very popular in this role, with the likes of Thunder Rosa going as far as to consider him her mentor. And the reason he's been able to get to this point is because during the 80s, 90s, and beyond, he proved himself to be one of the most underrated wrestlers in the world. Seriously, even in the late 2010s, when he was by that point reaching 50, Dustin was having some of the best matches of his career against opponents such as his brother Cody. And it wasn't like he only got good during his twilight run either, as in the 80s, the grandson of a plumber gained the nickname The Natural for a reason. What was this reason? Well, he was just naturally that good. So good, in fact, that his skills often got taken for granted. And that was why, despite being a part of the legendary Rhodes family, he never got the push to the world title scene. Sure, he would have success, particularly in WWF, where he got to portray the groundbreaking character of Goldust, but for as much as he made of that character, it was never able to reach the height of being a top-tier main event one. Did he deserve a run with the top prize? Of course, especially considering the fact that by the late 90s, the WWF title was bouncing around from person to person a lot more, so a brief reign wouldn't have seemed out of place. Unfortunately though, it just never worked out that way for him, and as a result, he'll go down in history as being yet another example of an excellent wrestler who's respected by everyone around him, but who never got to have the honor of calling himself the best in the world at any point during his career. But then you could argue that 90s WWF had an even bigger example of someone who should have been world champion getting cheated out of this spot, because during an era where Vince McMahon was starved for big stars more than ever, he still never put the belt on Scott Hall. Yes, out of the 5 members of the Clique, only 2 of them would never become world champion. And while Sean Waltman was great, he was never exactly presented at that level. When it came to the bad guy though, he could so easily have been the top guy, as he had both the look and the in-ring skills required for the job. But no matter how good he was, he always seemed to play second fiddle to either HBK, Diesel, or Bret the Hitman Hart. So this meant that, while he would get to challenge for the top prize on numerous occasions, it was always done with the intention of him putting the champion over. And while he would hold gold around his own waist multiple times, it would always be secondary belts, such as the Intercontinental title. Obviously frustrated with this then, Hall went as far as to approach Vince McMahon in late 1995 and ask him what he could do to climb that final rung on the ladder. And when the boss advised him that he just didn't see him as world championship material, it was exactly the motivation he needed to make the jump over to WCW and trigger the industry-changing NWO angle. That said though, even there though, Hall never reached the top tier, because with his alcoholism now reaching critical levels, he simply couldn't be trusted with the belt anymore. So while his New World Order stablemates Kevin Nash and Hulk Hogan won the WCW World title on multiple occasions, he'd always be left to watch in the wings. Thankfully though, while he never did reach the top of the mountain in the ring, Scott Hall did manage to beat his addiction issues out of the ring when he started living with Diamond Dallas Page in 2013. It's just a shame the same couldn't be said for one of their peers too, because not only would the British Bulldog never become a world champion himself, but he'd also end up succumbing to his demons. Prior to his drug addiction getting the better of him, however, there were few big men of his era who were more over and more talented than Davey Boy Smith. In fact, so good was he was able to become a star everywhere he went, whether that be in his home country of the UK, Japan, or even North America. But while he certainly made an impact in the former two, the US was where he had the most success, particularly under the WWF banner. And that's because while there, he'd become not only a two-time tag team champion, but also a two-time European and hardcore champion too. Of course, this paled in comparison to his greatest achievement though, because in 1992, in front of a sold-out London crowd inside of Wembley Stadium, Davey Boy beat his brother-in-law Bret Hart for the Intercontinental title. And based on the reaction he got that night, he'd be forgiven for thinking the main event was his next stop. But while there may have been early plans to push the Bulldog up to the world title scene here, these had to be scrapped when he was caught using steroids soon thereafter and was released as a result. And even if he was far from the only person who got caught up in the aftermath of the steroid trial, the Englishman's exit stage right here hurt more than others, because had it not happened, he very well could have become a world champion within the next couple of years. In the end though, after jumping over to WCW for a while and seeing his momentum stall there, by the time he returned to New York in 1994, he'd not have the same level of star power anymore. Not that he wasn't just as good as in the ring, no, far from it. But with Vince McMahon always looking for more than just a great technical wrestler when it came to deciding who to coronate next, it meant the brief window of opportunity for the British Bulldog had passed. And that's a shame because had he won the big belt before, he'd have had the honor of becoming the first ever British WWF champion. Instead though, fans would have to wait until 2020 to see this happen when Drew McIntyre defeated Brock Lesnar at WrestleMania 36. Still, it could have been a lot worse for Davey Boy. After all, he did win a lot of other important titles when he was an active wrestler. When it came to our next subject of today, however, while he would get the occasional belt to put around his waist, it was usually something which was treated pretty insignificantly. Not that this was on account of lack of skill on his part though, because even if he wasn't the best promo, Dean Malenko always brought it in the ring. Yes, living up to his moniker of the Iceman in full, Malenko carried himself like a cold technical assassin, one who spoke few words and instead let his wrestling skills speak for themselves. And this would see him find a lot of success in the cruiserweight divisions of ECW, WCW, and WWE during the 90s and early 2000s. Unfortunately though, on account of his relatively short stature and his perceived lack of charisma, he was never treated seriously as a main event player by any of his bosses during this period. And no matter how many classics he had against the likes of Chris Jericho or Rey Mysterio, he'd never be able to climb up those final rungs to reach the world title scene. Of course, had he been around today during an age where size is less of a hindrance than ever, maybe things would have been different. Just imagine what he could have done in modern-day AEW or New Japan's Juniors division, for example. But time can't be rewound, unfortunately, and so, instead, like everyone else we've discussed in this video today, Dean Malenko will go down as someone who had all the skills in the world and all the right tools with which to execute those skills, but who just couldn't pull it together to win a world title in the end, no matter how hard they tried.